So, one of the most touching Christmas stories that I've ever read was written a few years ago by a syndicated columnist named Greg Rummo. And I'd like to begin today by sharing Greg's Christmas story with you. He writes, "My most vivid Christmas memories surround my father. When I was 6, he braved a snowstorm one Christmas Eve, taking 2 buses and walking almost a mile just so he could surprise me with a puppy. Several years later, we trudged home together after a midnight Christmas Eve service through a blizzard. The snow sparkled like a million diamonds as it swirled through the air and drifted along the side of the road. When I was growing up, we always celebrated Christmas Day at my aunt's house. She was a great cook. Her specialties included fresh ham, stuffed turkey, potato casserole laced with mozzarella and covered with breadcrumbs, and chestnut pie topped with whipped cream. Those memories are priceless. But the events of Christmas Eve in 1996 overshadowed them all. On Christmas morning, our 2 sons were opening their gifts under the tree in the living room while carols played in the background. The aromas of bacon, coffee, and nutmeg and cinnamon-laced French toast wafted through the house as my wife cooked breakfast. The telephone rang, and she answered it with a cheerful, "Hello, Merry Christmas." There was a long silence. Suddenly, my wife gasped, "Oh, no. Greg, it's your parents' neighbor. He says your dad fell and he can't get up." She handed me the telephone. My knees grew weaker as I listened to the details. Dad was getting dressed for church that morning when he lost his balance while putting on a pair of trousers. He fell over backwards into the bathroom, and now he couldn't move. I jumped into the car for the 20-minute drive to my parents' apartment. By the time I arrived, Dad was in an ambulance. He was lying on a stretcher, his neck in a brace. "He broke his neck," I whispered, "didn't he?" "We're not sure, but we think so," the attendant replied. The ambulance brought Dad to St. Joseph's Hospital in Patterson while I gathered a few of Mom's belongings and drove her back to our home. "What happened to that nice man?" she asked. Mom was suffering from Alzheimer's disease. The nice man was her husband. Dad had promised to love Mom and to care for her in sickness and in health till death do us part. He was doing his best to live up to that promise he had made almost 50 years earlier. As Mom's condition had worsened, he couldn't care for her alone anymore. He sold their home in New York State and moved to West Milford the weekend before Thanksgiving so he could be closer to us. Those plans had just changed forever. After I got Mom settled at our home, I drove to the hospital. Dad had already been admitted to the intensive care unit. He was on his back, his head locked into position by a metal frame that had been screwed into his skull. "Hi, son," he said, forcing a smile. What a Christmas present this was. He asked how Mom and the grandchildren were doing, and then he said, "When I'm up and around in a few days, we'll get together and celebrate Christmas." I leaned over and kissed him and told him I'd be back momentarily. I walked into the adjacent waiting room. He doesn't know how badly he's hurt, I thought, as tears welled up in my eyes. Finally, 2 doctors appeared in the doorway. Their grim faces told the story. Dad died 2 days later. His last words to me as he struggled for breath were, "You're not my little boy anymore. Take care of Mom." None of my aunts and uncles attended his funeral. They had all passed away years earlier. Mom wasn't there either. We decided it was better for her to just believe that the nice man had simply gone away, and the people at the nursing home where she now lived were nice people also. When Dad died, a part of me died also with him. I lost the last person on this earth with whom I could share my childhood Christmas memories. And today, as I remember that Christmas Eve when he walked into the kitchen with a puppy in his arms, or our walk home together from church in the snowstorm, I am reminded of how much I miss him. Oh, what a story. You know, even though we may not have experienced exactly the horrific events that Greg Rummo did that terrible Christmas, I think, though, he expresses thoughts and emotions there that many of us can relate to. I've noticed that for many people, the hardest thing about the Christmas season isn't the stress and frenzy or the difficult family dynamics to navigate or all of the many things to do. For many, the most difficult part of the holidays is that these holidays can bring for us feelings of deep emptiness in our soul. What's supposed to be a time of great joy can in fact be a time of great grief for some. And maybe it's been that way for you this year. And if Christmas seems like something more to be endured than enjoyed, I want to invite you to listen carefully to everything that Greg Rummo wrote. I left off a little part that he wrote at the beginning because I didn't pay much attention to it at first when I first read this. But as I looked at it again, it really stood out to me. Just before he told this amazing story about his dad, he wrote this: "We all long for the perfect holiday as the year ends and a new one begins. To savor the peace and joy of the season, we must reconcile the disappointments, the tragedies of the past year, indeed our entire lifetime, as well as the triumphs large and small." And the words that stood out to me so much there were those words, to savor the peace and joy of the season. You read that and you realize that Greg Rummo's story is not just a sad story. It's also an odd story. I mean, can you imagine, despite all of the terrible memories that Christmas now brings for him, he still believes that he can savor the peace and joy of the season. And in fact, he not only says he could, he says he does do that. And it's hard not to read that and wonder, how in the world can that be? I read that story and I can't help but think about our story for today from Simeon in Luke 2, because just like Greg Rummo's story, it's a true story, and it's a sad story, and it's also a little bit odd. Simeon, we see, meets up with Mary and Joseph in the temple, and he has the day of his life. I picture him just like this, smiling and laughing and dancing and singing. And this is the odd part. The reason he's smiling and laughing and dancing and singing is because he has just gotten some news from God. And what is that news? The news is that he's going to die. In fact, he's going to die soon. This is more than a little odd. And then you read a little further in the story, down to verse 34, and it gets odder still. Simeon says to Mary about her baby Jesus these words: "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." Simeon, of course, is talking about the agony that Mary will endure many years later. One day, when her little baby becomes a man, she will watch him go to the cross of Calvary and endure horrific suffering to save the world from sin. But what strikes me as odd is not so much this, but the way that these words are introduced to us by Luke, the gospel writer. Verse 34 says, "Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary all of these things." You think about that. This is a blessing? Your child will cause many to fall. He will be spoken against, and a sword will pierce your own soul. That's your blessing? That's the kind of blessing that makes you long for a curse. Another story, again, a true story, and a sad story, and an odd story. In the 1870s, Horatio Spafford was a successful Chicago lawyer. Here he is. He invested most of his money, however, in real estate, and he was financially devastated by the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. As if that wasn't bad enough, shortly before that fire, his precious son died. And so 2 years later, Spafford and his family desperately needed some rest and renewal. And so he planned a trip to Europe with his wife and his 4 remaining children. But some last-minute business matters came up that prevented him from going. And not wanting to waste any more tickets than necessary, Spafford put his wife and 4 remaining daughters on a ship sailing for Great Britain and promised that he would take another ship soon and meet them over there. A few days later, the ship carrying his wife and daughters was struck by another ship and sank to the bottom of the ocean. All 4 of his remaining children drowned. His wife, miraculously, was saved and sent him the devastating news in a 2-word cable: "Saved alone." And so Horatio Spafford got on the next ship and went to meet his grieving wife. And as he came to the place in the ocean where his remaining children had been lost, he went down into his cabin and began to write. Now, you might expect a man in those kind of circumstances to be writing what? A suicide note? Instead, Horatio Spafford wrote words that would become the lyrics of one of Christendom's most beloved hymns. In the midst of unimaginable grief and sorrow, Horatio Spafford wrote these famous words: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." How do we explain these bizarre stories? How do you explain a man like Greg Rummo who says he can savor the peace and joy of the very day his father tragically died? How do you explain a man like Simeon who sings and dances and laughs and smiles on the day he receives a death sentence from God? How do you explain a woman like Mary who receives the news of the piercing of her own soul as a blessing? How do you explain a man like Horatio Spafford who loses all of his earthly possessions and nearly everyone he loves and still writes the words, "It is well with my soul"? Well, there is only one explanation. All of these stories, while very diverse in time and circumstances, all of them have something in common. And the incredible message of hope and encouragement from God for you this morning, and especially for those of you who may be enduring another Christmas season, is that you can savor the peace and joy of this season also. You can consider yourself blessed. You can sing, "It is well with my soul," no matter what your circumstances are, if you share with them what they shared with each other. I didn't tell you at first how Greg Rummo's story began. I also didn't tell you how it ends. This is how the story of his father's death actually ends. He writes this: "Today, as I remember that Christmas Eve when he walked into the kitchen with a puppy in his arms, or our walk home together from church in the snowstorm, I am reminded of how much I miss him. But then I am also reminded of God the Father's promise to me through his little boy, Jesus Christ, that he would become a father of the fatherless. And my grief is comforted by a peace which surpasses all understanding." These stories are all very different, but they all mention two things. First, the very real presence of Jesus Christ. Simeon and Mary held him in their own arms, and yet Christ's presence was no less real to Greg Rummo when he realized that the words of Almighty God were a personal promise to him. And it was equally real to Horatio Spafford on that ship. He was overcome by unimaginable grief, and yet in that very moment he was equally overcome by a living hope as he remembered and wrote, quote, "that Christ hath regarded my helpless estate and hath shed his own blood for my soul." All of these stories mention Jesus. And not coincidentally, they also all mention peace. Simeon would sing, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you now dismiss your servant in peace." Horatio Spafford would write, "When peace like a river attendeth my way." Greg Rummo would write, "My grief is comforted by a peace which surpasses all understanding." How could they have peace in the midst of those kind of circumstances? Well, they could have it because this is precisely what Jesus Christ came to earth to give. God himself said through the prophet Isaiah that Jesus came not only to live the perfect life we could never live and die the death we deserved to die at the cross. He came, according to Isaiah, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Those are beautiful, poetic words, aren't they? Don't you think for one moment that that's all they are? Because our Lord Jesus does what he says. This is what he did for Simeon, it's what he did for Mary, it's what he did for Horatio Spafford and Greg Rummo. It is what he has done for millions upon millions of people throughout the ages in all kinds of circumstances. And it's what he would like to do for you. Let's bow our heads and pray.